Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Here we go. In July 1981, Ken McElroy was shot in broad daylight in Skidmore, Missouri, with dozens of people nearby and no one ever naming the shooter. His death became one of America's strangest unsolved cases because an entire town stayed silent. In March 1941, a roadside show near Fort Bragg displayed worn figures of famous outlaws as part of a homemade crime museum. Kursk sank in the Barents Sea in 2000 with all 118 crew members lost. The submarine was later raised from the seabed, and its torn bow became one of the most haunting images of the disaster. In the 1950s, flight attendants sometimes lit cigars for passengers right at their seats during the flight. Smoking was treated as a normal part of air travel until health rules and cabin bans changed it decades later. In 1981, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Walter Cronkite, James Brady, and Ed Meese were photographed laughing over champagne inside the White House. The image captured some of the most recognizable political. Stela B at Copan was dedicated on August 18, 731, during the rule of 18 Rabbit. The carved ruler appears as Chak, and the monument also ties him to Venus as the evening star. The Volgograd tractor factory could turn out huge lines of tracked machines, showing the industrial scale the Soviet Union built for heavy production. During the Battle of Stalingrad, this same factory became a combat zone. On September 1, 1915, an Austro-Hungarian field telephone unit worked from a shell crater in Galicia. These crews carried wire across open ground because one broken line could cut off orders in minutes. On October 20, 1950, the American 187th Airborne made the first combat jump of the Korean War near Sukchon and Suncheon. The drop was meant to cut off retreating North Korean forces before they could escape north. In 1963, Valentina Tereshkova landed in the Altai region after becoming the first woman in space. Her Vostok 6 mission lasted almost 3 days and orbited Earth 48 times. A Nazarena waits at a crosswalk in Seville during Holy Week, dressed in the pointed robe used by penitents in Spain's Easter processions. The tradition goes back centuries, and these figures can walk for hours through the city as part of Brotherhood rituals. On June 9, 1953, Chesapeake and Ohio locomotive number 1642 tore apart near Hinton, West Virginia, after a boiler failure. The force was so extreme that the boiler was thrown completely off the frame and onto the tracks. Alvin Shipwreck Kelly, the man who made pole sitting famous, is seen perched high above the ground in 1942. He helped turn an endurance stunt into a national craze during the 1920s and 1930s. In 1988, a giant statue of Vladimir Lenin lay on a truck while a woman with a scythe rode past in the Soviet Union. The photo captured two worlds in one frame, the fading weight of state symbols and the ordinary life moving beside them. On September 9, 1970, the first Vaz 2101 rolled off the line in Tolyatti, launching the car later known across the Soviet Union as the Kopeka. Built from the Fiat 124 design, the Bartini-Berry V Via-14 was a Soviet aircraft built to take off from water and hunt enemy submarines. Only one prototype flew, which is why it still looks like a machine from a future that never arrived. On April 5, 1942, Allied troops and wounded men attended Palm Sunday Mass inside Malinta Tunnel on Corregidor. The tunnel held about 1,000 hospital beds and served as the island's main command center during the siege. For Gemini 3, the Erector was lowered in test runs before launch on March 23, 1965, when NASA prepared the first crewed Gemini mission. Gemini 3 carried Gus Grissom and John Young and lasted almost 5 hours in orbit. The Heinkel He-111H-8 was fitted with a heavy cable cutter to slash through the steel lines of British barrage balloons. It was one of the Luftwaffe's more unusual fixes, built for a threat that could tear apart an aircraft without a single shot being fired. At Inchtooth Hill in Roman Scotland, archaeologists found a hidden pile of 875,400 iron nails buried around 87 AD. The Romans left them underground when they abandoned the fort, so local tribes could not turn them into weapons. United States Army Air Force's Mechanics Service, a Pratt and Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engine removed from a B-24 Liberator during the war. The B-24 used 4 of these radial engines. Josephine Joseph, a famous half-and-half sideshow performer, appeared in Todd Browning's Freaks in 1932. She was also a longtime Coney Island attraction and became one of the best-known illusion acts of the era. British servicemen in drag stage a mock cooking class in a wartime performance between 1910 and 1919. Concert parties like this were common in camp life, where soldiers used comedy and costume shows to break the routine far from the front. In 1991, the Antonov and 225 Mriya appeared at Philadelphia International Airport as the largest aircraft in the world. Built to carry the Soviet Buran space shuttle, only one was completed, and it became an aviation legend. On July 10, 1945, former fascist minister Guido Buffarini Guidi was photographed in Milan moments before his death. One of Mussolini's closest loyalists, he had served as Italy's interior minister during the final years of the regime. Hawker's last Hurricane, PZ-865, was finished at Langley with the words, "The last of the many," painted across it. After the war, it survived as a civilian aircraft and later joined the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, where it still flies. On September 14, 1930, Nazi campaign posters filled the streets during Germany's election as political extremism surged in public view. That vote gave Hitler's party 107 seats in the Reichstag, a huge jump that turned it into a national force. On March 23, 1951, Operation Tomahawk dropped thousands of United Nations paratroopers north of Seoul in the largest one-day airborne assault of the Korean War. More than 120 transport planes took part. On May 19, 1962, Marilyn Monroe and John Fitzgerald Kennedy were photographed together at his birthday celebration in New York. Monroe would die less than 3 months later, and Kennedy would be dead the next year. Inside the Luna Vasahi Temple at Mount Abu, marble was carved so deeply and precisely that the whole shrine looks almost weightless. Built in the 13th century as part of the Dilwara temples, it remains one of the finest surviving examples of Jain stonework in India. On March 24, 1958, Elvis Presley was drafted into the United States Army at the height of his fame. The next day, he got a regulation haircut, turning one of the world's biggest stars into Private Presley. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon as the Vietnam War reached its final day. Just hours after the last American evacuation, this advance marked the fall of South Vietnam and the end of the war. On March 23, 1965, Gus Grissom and John Young rode Gemini 3 on the first two-man spaceflight, launched by the United States. The mission lasted almost 5 hours and became the first American crewed flight able to change orbit in space. Steve McQueen trains on a heavy bag in this 1963 life photo, looking more like a real gym regular than a movie star. Boxing stayed part of his image for years, helping shape the hard-edged screen presence that made him famous. In 1967, a young Arnold Schwarzenegger lifted a 508-pound stone in Bavaria. He later said the lift was done cold, with no warm-up at all. This chemcraft chemistry set from the 1970s gave children real glass tubes, labeled compounds, and hands-on experiments at home. It came from a time when science kits felt much less filtered, which is why sets like this still look so surprising today. In 1983, returned glass bottles were still being sorted by hand at collection points like this one. The scene captures how reuse worked before plastic took over, when empty bottles were part of a full deposit system instead of simple waste. Marilyn Monroe shared coffee with Handyman Gil during the filming of Let Us Make Love in 1960. She later gave him a signed photo that said there was nothing like his coffee. In March 2003, United States Navy personnel inspected a Japanese-type 96 25mm cannon hidden inside a cave on Iwo Jima. Nearly 60 years after the battle, the island was still revealing intact pieces of its underground war defenses. During a 15-minute break at a garment factory, workers used the aisle between machines for group exercise. The photo shows how even short pauses in Soviet factory life could turn into organized routines on the shop floor. Around 1910 in Alaska, an Inuit healer stood with a sick boy wearing furs, a carved mask, and oversized model hands. The image captures a healing ritual staged with powerful costume and symbolism, not just medicine alone. In June 1938, Rosemary Kennedy was photographed with her father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., at the opening of the London Children's Zoo. Just 3 years later, her life changed permanently after a lobotomy ordered by her family. French troops moved through Tonkin in 1890, just 5 years after the war that secured French control over northern Vietnam. The campaign helped lock Vietnam into French colonial rule for decades. In 1956, USS Oregon was being scrapped in Kawasaki, ending the long life of one of America's most famous early battleships. She became legendary after her dash around South America in 1898, a voyage that helped turn her into a national symbol overnight. In 1972, Vesna Vulovic survived a fall of 33,330 feet after her plane broke apart over Czechoslovakia. She was the only survivor and still holds the world record for the highest fall survived without a parachute. In about 1904, Inuit girls in Alaska were photographed holding puppies in front of a camp tent. The image preserves a quiet, everyday moment from Arctic life, far from the staged explorer scenes more often shown from that era. Mengistu Haile Mariam helped overthrow Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974 and later ruled Ethiopia from 1977 to 1991. This photo captures one of the most powerful figures of the Cold War era in Africa. In 1956, Minnie Pearl entertained the crowd at the Grand Ole Opry alongside Governor Frank Clement, his wife, and Mitch Miller. By then, she was already one of the Opry's best-known voices, famous for turning country radio into national entertainment. In 1923, Moonshine Mary Wozniak became the first woman in Illinois convicted for selling illegal liquor linked to a death. Her case captured one of the darker sides of prohibition, when bad homemade alcohol could turn deadly. On March 22, 1946, General Leclerc laid flowers at a colonial war memorial in Vietnam after it had been redressed with the flag of the new state. Dan Blocker stood 6'4" and at his heaviest weighed about 365 pounds. Best known as Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza, his size made him one of the most physically striking stars on American television. On September 29, 1939, Red Army soldiers handed out Soviet newspapers to villagers near Vilnius after the Soviet move into eastern Poland. The image shows how quickly military control was followed by propaganda on the ground. On June 26, 1936, a train wreck lay beside the Bethlehem steel plant along the Conemaugh River in Johnstown. The crash happened in a city already infamous for disaster after the deadly flood that had made Johnstown known across America decades earlier. The band of Australia's 5th Brigade marched through Bapaume on March 19, 1917, just after the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line. The ruined square showed what retreat had left behind. Soviet troops on Cuba were photographed in civilian clothes with rifles because the 1962 deployment was carried out under strict secrecy. The disguise was so unusual that photos like this still look staged. A Fallschirmjäger pushes a cart through deep Russian mud, one of the worst enemies of the German army on the Eastern Front. In Rasputitsa season, roads turned into sludge so thick that even men, horses, and vehicles could barely move. On August 17, 1864, this was the only known photograph taken inside the Confederate prison camp at Andersonville, Georgia. Even just 6 months after opening, the camp was already packed beyond capacity, with too little water and almost no sanitation. Empress Farah Pahlavi inspects a girls' school in northwestern Iran in the late 1960s, during the Pahlavi era push to modernize education and expand women's public roles. By the 1970s, women were entering Iranian universities in much larger numbers. This is the last publicly known photo of Bob Ross with his son Stephen before Ross died in 1995. Stephen later followed him into painting and appeared in episodes of The Joy of Painting. This is the last known photo of Bhagat Singh, taken before he was executed in 1931 at just 23 years old. He had already become one of the most famous faces of anti-British resistance in India before his death. In 1931, Joseph Stalin was photographed with his daughter, Svetlana, Lavrenti Beria, and Abkhaz leader Nestor Lakoba. Stalin later ordered that Svetlana was never to be left alone with Beria. On July 15, 1944, American ground crew on Saipan installed a water regulator on the P-47 Thunderbolt called Moonshine Bar Flies. Photos like this show how air power depended not just on pilots. In about 1930, market vendors worked inside the ruined cloth hall at Ypres, where daily life had returned to a city shattered by the First World War. The land around Ypres was so damaged that farming stayed difficult for years. Women at the Central Women's School of Sniper Training stand in uniform in 1943, part of the Soviet Union's effort to train female combat snipers during the war. Soviet women served with deadly effect on the front. In January 1943, Clark Gable trained in a turret gun simulator after joining the United States Army Air Forces. He later flew combat missions over Europe, turning one of Hollywood's biggest stars into a real wartime airman. In 1974, a stolen Army helicopter ended up on the south lawn of the White House after Army Private Robert Preston flew it there. Federal police forced it down on the grounds, turning the stunt into one of the strangest security breaches in White House history. On March 8, 1979, more than 100,000 Iranian women marched against the new compulsory hijab rule after the Islamic Revolution. The protests lasted for days and became one of the earliest mass public challenges to the new government. Marshal Semyon Budyonny stands beside his young son Sergei in a striking Soviet family portrait from the 1940s. Budyonny was one of the first 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, making this a rare glimpse of one of the Red Army's most famous commanders at home. In 1907, workers were still hacking the Panama Canal through rock, mud, and deadly heat, while many doubted it would ever be finished. Just 7 years later, ships were crossing it, turning one of the hardest engineering projects on Earth into a working canal. Gary Ray painted this image of the Colossus of New York in 2010, inspired by the 1958 science fiction film. The blurred giant figure keeps the mood of the movie, where a dead man is rebuilt as a towering machine after an experiment goes wrong. Pierre Brossolette, one of the key unifiers of the French resistance, died in Nazi custody in 1944 after giving only his own name. Rather than expose others under interrogation, he kept the network protected to the end. In 1982, an old airplane in Yevpatoria was turned into a cafe instead of being scrapped. Places like this appeared in several Soviet cities, and many people still remember eating ice cream inside them as children. The radium girls painted glowing watch dials by hand, and many were told to shape their brushes with their lips while working with radium. Their fight in court helped expose the damage and pushed major changes in American workplace safety laws. In 1989, an ACT UP protester dressed like a vampire held a sign calling Donald Trump a nightmare on Trump Street. The image captured how AIDS activists used street theater, costumes, and sharp visuals to turn protest into headlines. Teofil Dziama, a Polish Air Force officer and Auschwitz resistance member, was photographed in the camp in April 1941. He was later put to death there on October 11, 1943, together with 54 other prisoners. On August 11, 1942, survivors of HMS Eagle were filmed aboard a destroyer after the carrier went down during Operation Pedestal. Eagle sank within minutes after being hit by German submarine U-73. In 1956, USS Oregon was being scrapped in Kawasaki, ending the life of one of America's most famous early battleships. In 1898, her dash around South America to join the Spanish-American War made her a national sensation almost overnight. On April 14, 1961, Yuri Gagarin's motorcade moved through packed Moscow streets just 2 days after he became the first human in space. The crowds were so huge that the welcome looked more like a national victory parade than a simple homecoming. A Japanese sentry stands guard in ruined Bacolod during the occupation of the Philippines, holding an Arisaka Type 99 rifle with a fixed bayonet. The city later became a key Japanese airbase on Negros. In East Berlin around 1974, Second World War ruins still stood between newer buildings with the words "Never Again War" painted on the wall. The scene showed how long the damage remained visible in the city. Future Farmers of America students study a new Farmel tractor in Vernon County, Wisconsin in 1942. Farm machines like this were rapidly replacing horse-drawn work and changing daily life on American farms. In 1967, soldiers haul a field gun through Vietnam's dense jungle, where mud and thick vines turned every step into hard labor. In this terrain, the landscape itself could slow entire units, making movement as punishing as the mission. The iceberg photographed the morning after the Titanic sank in 1912 is widely believed to be the one the ship struck in the North Atlantic. The photo was taken before the crew even knew the disaster had happened, which gives it an especially eerie place in history. Coal miners ride underground in a small train called the Paddy as it carries them to the coalface, the place where the seam was cut. In some deep mines, that trip could stretch for miles before the real work even began. A young Viet Cong fighter holds a rare M14E2 automatic rifle, a scarce version of the M14 made in very small numbers. Only 8,350 were produced, which makes photos of one in the field especially unusual. Lewis Hine photographed workers at the Bliss Shaft in Nanticoke in 1911, centering the frame on a boy who appears far too young for mine work. His image became part of the evidence that exposed how common child labor still was in industrial America. A snowman salutes Soviet troops near the border sign in Berlin in February 1957, turning a frozen street into one of the Cold War's strangest real images. The scene feels almost unreal, but the divided city behind it was one of the most tense places on Earth. The Rialto Theater burns in Allentown in 1946 as fire crews send streams of water into smoke so thick it swallows the block. One theater fire could shut down an entire downtown street, turning a busy city corner into a scene people remembered for years. Workers paved Compton Avenue in 1906 by setting brick across the entire street by hand, one block at a time. The twin towers of St. Anthony of Padua, rising in the distance, make this feel like a city being built in real time. Soldiers ferry field artillery across the Potomac on a raft of blanket boats in July 1863, just after the Battle of Gettysburg. It is a striking Civil War image because even heavy cannons had to move by improvised river crossings when speed mattered most. A soldier shares his food with two Dutch children in 1945, in a Europe still marked by hunger at the end of the war. For many children in the Netherlands, a meal like this could mean far more than the photo shows. A Victorian-era portrait shows a woman with hair falling nearly to the floor, creating one of those real images that almost look staged. In the 19th century, hair like this took years of care to grow, which made extreme length both rare and instantly memorable. This horse-drawn photographic wagon carried a darkroom into the field in 1855, when photographers had to prepare and develop images on the spot before the chemicals dried. The cookhouse of the 8th Hussars shows soldiers gathered around a field kitchen, one of the few places in camp that offered warmth and routine. In military life, the food station was often the busiest spot because every man passed through it, no matter the rank. Prison guards and inmates pose at a jail in the Bukhara Emirate in 1907, in what is now Uzbekistan. The barred doorway and calm faces make the scene feel almost unreal, but it shows a prison world that had barely changed for centuries. The wreckage of a streetcar and train collision in Lexington, Kentucky in 1907 drew huge crowds within hours. Early city crossings like this were notoriously dangerous because streetcars and trains often shared cramped tracks with almost no margin for error. 15-year-old Léon Mergian, said to be the youngest soldier in the French volunteer unit attached to the German Army's 638th Infantry Regiment, stands in Golovkovo near Moscow in 1941. Muslim women in Yugoslavia march with signs supporting Tito and Stalin in 1944. The photo shows how openly the partisan movement used public street rallies in the final year of the war. Freed mothers hold newborn babies at Dachau in 1945 in one of the most unexpected images to come out of the camp after liberation. The photo captures a stark fact of survival. Even in a place built to break people, new life was still beginning. A man in Alaşehir, Turkey, builds a shelter from ruined walls in 1923 after the town was devastated during the Greco-Turkish War. The tree growing through the broken structure makes the scene even more striking. Apollo 11 mission officials celebrate the successful launch on July 16, 1969, the first step toward the moon landing. This was the moment the mission moved from years of planning to the flight that would put humans on the moon 4 days later. A chaplain blesses the crew of the B-17G Fifinella before a mission in Britain in 1944. Many bomber crews faced such high losses that rituals like this became part of every flight. Freed mothers with newborn babies sit in Dachau in 1945 after liberation. The image records a rare fact from the camp. Some women gave birth there and survived. Cirque Molière performers pose on a balance beam around 1900, with one artist standing on a rolling sphere between two dogs. The famous Paris circus was amateur, which makes the precision in this act even more remarkable. An American B-17 drops food over Schiphol during Operation Chowhound in 1945, when bombers were used to feed starving civilians instead of attack targets. In just days, Allied crews delivered thousands of tons of food to the Western Netherlands. A vintage Toyota Corolla ad sells quality and fuel economy at a time when small cars were becoming a serious part of the American market. The listed mileage, 39 highway and 24 city, was a major selling point during the fuel-conscious 1970s. In 1964, segregationists rushed into the surf to block black beachgoers at a whites-only beach during the civil rights struggle. Rosie Ruiz crossed the Boston Marathon finish line first among women in 1980, then became infamous when officials found she had skipped much of the course. She was stripped of the title 8 days later in one of the race's biggest scandals. A farm Halloween costume from Camp Dix, New Jersey, in 1917 looks more unsettling than many modern horror props. Early homemade costumes like this were often meant to feel strange and eerie, not cute. Police photographed suspicious items found in Ted Bundy's car in Salt Lake City in August 1975 after a traffic stop led to his arrest. That evidence became central in the Carol DeRanch kidnapping case, one of the first charges that began to expose him. A 1960 magazine ad pairs Coca-Cola with ballet dancers to sell refreshment through elegance and poise. It shows how brands used glamour and performance to make everyday products feel stylish. Volunteer firefighters in Istanbul pose with hand pumps and hoses in the 1870s, when most city fires were fought with muscle and speed. In a city built largely of wood, crews like this were often the only barrier between one fire and an entire neighborhood. The snaggle-toothed snake eel can grow about 3 feet long and lives in shallow tropical water as well as deeper areas. This washed-up specimen from Mexico looks especially eerie because exposure made its eyes bulge and its teeth stand out. The wreckage left by the Great Galveston Hurricane in 1900 shows entire buildings smashed and pushed off their foundations. The storm killed an estimated 8,000 people, making it the deadliest natural disaster in United States history. Chevy Chase high school students practice home economics in 1935, learning cooking and household work on full-sized gas appliances. Classes like this were designed to train girls for domestic life. The Niagara cable car crosses above the raging water in 1916, turning one of the world's most famous natural sights into a suspended ride. Hanging over the whirlpool made the crossing itself the attraction. A California 10th grader presented a science fair project on the effects of LSD on fish in 1972. The display shows how unusually open some school experiments could be in that era. A blindfolded survivor from a sunken German U-boat is led away as a prisoner in 1943. The photo captures the abrupt shift from hunter to captive in the Atlantic War. President John F. Kennedy receives the White House Thanksgiving turkey in 1963 during the annual presentation ceremony. The photo was taken just days before his death, which gives an ordinary holiday tradition an unexpected place in history. A Russian soldier turns his rifle on deserters in 1917 as the Imperial Army was collapsing under war and revolution. By that year, desertion had grown so widespread that discipline itself was starting to break apart. American and Soviet tanks faced each other at Checkpoint Charlie in 1961 during one of the Cold War's most dangerous standoffs. For about 16 hours, the two sides sat only yards apart in the center of Berlin. Betty Ford meets Vietnamese refugee children at Camp Pendleton in 1975 during the mass evacuation that followed the fall of Saigon. The camp became one of the main first stops for thousands of refugees arriving in the United States. Frank V. McKinless swears in the first women Marines in New York in 1943. The photo marks the year women officially entered the Marine Corps Reserve during the Second World War. Gamal Abdel Nasser watches work at the Aswan High Dam, the giant project that became a symbol of modern Egypt. The dam transformed control of the Nile and created Lake Nasser, one of the world's largest artificial lakes. The New York Times newsroom in 1942 shows reporters working at shared desks with typewriters, telephones, and stacks of copy. It captures how a major paper ran before computers, when every story moved by hand, voice, and paper. The German 7th Panzer Division prepares for the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. The division was one of Germany's fastest armored units and had already earned the nickname Ghost Division in France. Early GPS receivers in the late 1970s were so large that soldiers had to carry them like field radios. The photo shows how satellite navigation began as bulky military gear long before it fit in a pocket. Gandhi wrote to Hitler in July 1939, urging him to stop a war that could devastate humanity. The letter is striking because Gandhi addressed the man he believed could still prevent catastrophe. Wall Street fills with crowds on November 11, 1918, as news of the armistice ends the First World War. The scene shows how instantly the financial district turned into a public celebration. Henry Johnson sits with fellow soldier Needham Roberts in France during the First World War, shortly after the night attack that made Johnson famous. He fought off a German raiding party with a rifle, a knife, and sheer force. The Mona Lisa is displayed in Florence in 1913 after the painting was recovered from the theft that made it world famous. The thief had hidden it for more than 2 years before trying to sell it in Italy. Joseph Kittinger steps from Excelsior 3 in 1960, beginning the jump that set multiple high-altitude records. He fell from more than 102,000 feet, making it one of the most daring human tests ever photographed. A Korean husband and wife pose in traditional everyday dress in 1904. The photo captures ordinary clothing from late Joseon, Korea, just before the country was pulled into rapid change. Jackie Kennedy stands beside John F. Kennedy as he leaves the hospital after spinal surgery in 1954. His chronic back problems were so severe that they followed him long before the presidency. A school class photo from Austria in 1899 is widely said to include a young Adolf Hitler standing in the back row. The image is striking because it shows one of history's most infamous figures before anyone could know what he would become. Little Coyote and Morning Star pose for a studio portrait in 1873, wearing ceremonial clothing and ornaments. The image preserves a formal native portrait from an era when photography was beginning to record tribal leaders. Dr. Jack Kevorkian's Royal Oak Police mugshot was taken in 1993 after he was arrested for helping a terminally ill patient die. The arrest made him the face of the national fight over doctor-assisted death. Former slave Willis Wynn stands outside his cabin in Texas in 1936, decades after emancipation. The photo turns the long gap between slavery and living memory into something real and immediate. A slave pen owned by Price, Birch & Company stands in Alexandria, Virginia during the Civil War era. Buildings like this were used to confine enslaved people before sale, making the trade visible in the middle of an American town. Bulgarian soldiers aimed their rifles at an airplane in one of the earliest forms of air defense. The photo captures how troops tried to stop aircraft before dedicated anti-aircraft guns became common. Ebony imagined Michael Jackson in the year 2000 in a 1985 feature about how black stars might age. The prediction missed badly, which is exactly what makes the page so fascinating. A Royal Navy vessel is displayed in London in 1918, with Tower Bridge looming behind it through the mist. The war had turned submarines and patrol craft into public symbols, so even a boat like this could draw crowds in the middle of the city. A Korean mother embraces her son in 1953 after he escaped a North Korean prisoner of war camp soon after the armistice. The photo captures the exact moment the Korean War stopped being history and became a family reunion. The Texas City disaster wrecked the harbor in April 1947 after a ship loaded with ammonium nitrate exploded. The blast killed about 600 people and became one of the deadliest industrial disasters in United States history. Indigenous children stand praying in a Canadian residential school where the government and church forced many children to abandon their language and culture. The image captures one of the system's core realities. Forced religious discipline was built into daily life. Children in liberated Nikolaev tear down a poster of Adolf Hitler after the city was retaken from German forces. The photo captures the collapse of occupation in one raw street moment. Jackie Mitchell shakes hands with Babe Ruth in 1931 after striking out both Ruth and Lou Gehrig in an exhibition game. She remains the only woman widely credited with doing it. Thousands of German prisoners of war march down the Autobahn under guard as the Third Reich collapses. The scale of the column shows how completely Germany's army was being broken apart at the end of the war. Little Nap, billed as the Napoleon of the chimpanzee world, was photographed in costume in 1915 as a tourist attraction. The image shows how early entertainment often turned animals into stage characters for public spectacle. John F. Kennedy stands with Jacqueline Kennedy at the 1961 inaugural ball on the day he became President of the United States. He was the youngest elected president in American history. Mickey Dehan, a boxer from Derry, faces RUC officers during the Battle of the Bogside in 1969. The photo captures one of the most tense street clashes of the Troubles when Bogside residents fought to keep police out of their area. This photo shows the wreckage left by an IRA bombing in Coventry, England in August 1939. It was one of the first attacks of the IRA bombing campaign in Britain, turning an ordinary city street into a scene of sudden destruction. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip arrive in New York in 1957 with the Statue of Liberty behind them. It was her first official visit to the United States as Queen. German women march with portraits of Joseph Stalin in May 1951 at the height of Soviet power in East Germany. Just 6 years after the war, his face was already being carried like a symbol of the new order shaping half of Europe. 17-year-old Norma Jean stands on a California beach in 1943, years before the world knew her as Marilyn Monroe. At the time, she was still an unknown teenager working in a wartime factory life that would soon change forever. On April 21, 1996, Chechen leader Dzhokhar Dudayev was tracked and struck during a Russian operation. This image is taken from the guidance view of the missile, capturing the final second of one of the most hunted men in the First Chechen War. Elvis Presley eats in the Fort Chaffee cafeteria in 1958, days after he was drafted into the United States Army. It is one of the rare moments when the biggest music star in America looked like an ordinary soldier. These were fake bamboo planes found on Okinawa in 1945, built to fool enemy pilots from the air. Even near the end of the war, Japan was still using simple decoys to protect what it had left. Mercedes-Benz workers formed a giant Heil Hitler sign for aircraft flying overhead in Nazi Germany. The image shows how deeply major German industry was tied to the regime long before the war reached its darkest years. In San Francisco, during the 1918 flu pandemic, a federal truck is loaded with coffins as the city struggles with a wave of deaths. The pandemic infected about 1/3 of the world and killed tens of millions in just 2 years. Jack Johnson stands with his wife Etta Terry Duryea at the peak of the Jim Crow era, when he became the first black heavyweight champion in history. His victories broke one of the hardest barriers in sport and made him one of the most feared men in the ring. Japanese transport ships burn in Simpson Harbor during an American air raid in the Pacific War. The strike hit one of Japan's key supply points and turned the harbor into a graveyard of wrecked ships. This double-decker Westinghouse bus was built at the Marta factory in Arad and made its first trip on June 28, 1908. It carried 34 passengers and was one of the earliest motor buses seen in the region. A French commando from the 2nd Shock Battalion captures a German soldier hiding in a roadside ditch under a wrecked car. The photo shows how the war in Europe often ended at point-blank range, with soldiers dragged out of cover one by one. This 1906 ad shows an Indian motorcycle tri-car, one of the earliest motor vehicles built for everyday passengers. Before cars took over the road, machines like this were the future people were being told to trust. In a Soviet felt boot workshop in the 1920s, a worker shows his finished pair to the man tracking daily output. The photo captures how closely factory labor was counted in the early USSR, when every item was tied to quotas and records. This 1908 Caterpillar tractor carries its own bridge to cross a brook without stopping. Early machines like this had to solve the road before they could move forward. German submarine UC-61 ran aground near Boulogne-sur-Mer in 1917 after a failed mission in the English Channel. Once trapped in plain sight, it became a captured machine instead of a hidden hunter. The Endurance is locked in Antarctic ice in 1915 during Ernest Shackleton's doomed expedition. The ship was crushed and lost, but every man survived one of the most brutal escape stories in polar history. This 1886 photo shows a white boy living among Native Americans in the United States. Images like this came from a time when children were often taken, traded, or raised between completely different worlds. A German soldier steps out of a trench in 1917 wearing rare body armor and carrying a sawback bayonet. Both were made for brutal close combat, which is why this photo feels more like the future than the First World War. In Baltimore in 1909, undercover police posed in disguise beside a captured suspect after the operation was over. The photo shows how plainclothes work was already part of American policing long before modern detective units. Marilyn Monroe relaxes in a private room during a life photo session, far from the polished image the world knew. Photos like this mattered because they showed the gap between the public icon and the real woman behind it. This 1937 Soviet manual shows exactly how carrier pigeons were strapped to a soldier for transport. Even in the age of radios, armies still trusted birds to carry messages when machines failed. Iranian soldiers in gas masks hold position during Operation Badr in 1985 in one of the most haunting images from the Iran-Iraq War. The Persian sign behind them says, "Smile, my brother," which makes the scene feel even more unreal. An American soldier in South Vietnam carries the E-63X-M2, an early device built to detect enemy movement through sound and vibration in 1967. It looked like a radio pack, but it was part of the war's first push toward electronic tracking in the jungle. This is a Nazi gas van photographed around 1941, one of the vehicles used by mobile killing units during the Holocaust. For decades, no confirmed photo of one was known, which is why this image feels so chillingly rare. This 1920s photo shows members of a secret society in Latin America wearing robes marked with skulls. Images like this are rare because groups built on ritual and secrecy were not meant to be seen by outsiders. A German student takes part in a racial theory class in 1943, learning ideas the regime pushed through schools. Photos like this show that indoctrination in Germany started in the classroom, not just on the battlefield. In Leningrad in 1927, doctors used hypnosis as a treatment for alcoholism in the Soviet Union. The photo shows how medicine at the time still experimented with methods that now feel strange and unsettling. In 1921, New Yorker writer Lois Long stands like the new decade itself, while an older office world stares back at her in disbelief. The photo captures the exact moment flapper style stopped looking like fashion and started looking like rebellion. Tim Curry waits between takes as Pennywise in 1990, already looking unsettling even off camera. That is why this behind-the-scenes photo feels almost as eerie as the film itself. In Rome in 1948, a blind boy who lost both hands during the war learns Braille with his lips. It is one of those rare photos that shows how people rebuilt a life after losing almost everything. Arnold Schwarzenegger stands with Hugh Hefner and Wilt Chamberlain, and Wilt makes everyone around him look small. Photos like this remind you that even Arnold did not look huge next to a 7'1" basketball giant. In 1960, a Fairchild C-119 caught a film capsule in mid-air after it returned from orbit. Before digital images existed, some of America's first spy satellites had to drop their photos back to Earth like this. Robert Shaw relaxes beside the mechanical shark during the filming of Jaws, the movie that changed fear of the ocean forever. The fake shark looked awkward off camera, but on screen it helped create one of the most famous villains in film history. This photo shows Yakuza members and their wives covered in full-body tattoos, one of the clearest symbols of identity inside Japan's criminal underworld. Traditional irizumi could take years to finish, which made the body itself a record of loyalty, pain, and status. Shown here as a young Brad Pitt, this photo was taken years before Hollywood turned him into one of the biggest stars in the world. Long before the fame, he was just a school kid with a basketball trophy. After the Battle of Monte Cassino, some Moroccan Goumiers in the Allied forces attacked civilians in nearby Italian villages. The photo is tied to one of the war's darkest aftermaths, when victory was followed by terror for the people who survived the fighting. Ernest Hemingway grins behind bars after one of his wild parties, turning the scene into something that looks more like a stunt than an arrest. Photos like this fit his legend perfectly because he lived almost as hard as the men he wrote about. On March 8, 1927, crowds in Andijan gathered to burn the paranja during a Soviet campaign against traditional veiling in Uzbekistan. The photo captures a public ritual meant to show a new order replacing the old one. At the New York World's Fair in 1939, models showed how swimwear had changed over the previous 50 years. In one lineup, heavy beach outfits gave way to the lighter, body-shaped styles of the modern era. In China in 1946, women stand in a narrow courtyard waiting for clients at a brothel. The photo shows a hidden side of city life that usually stayed behind closed doors. Teenagers sit together in a Massachusetts school auditorium in 1950, looking far more relaxed than schools usually allowed at the time. Photos like this matter because they show that even in the strict 1950s, youth culture was already changing the rules. Activist Ben Maisel smokes in a polling booth during the 1976 presidential election, using a legal loophole that blocked arrest while voting. The photo turned a voting booth into a protest stage and made his point impossible to miss. The Lincoln Futura was built in 1955 as a wild concept car, then returned in 1966 as the first Batmobile for television. Few prototypes ever got a second life this famous. A boy in Derry sits on a rooftop with Molotov cocktails during the Battle of the Bogside in 1969. The image shows how even teenagers were pulled into one of the first major street battles of the Troubles. London in the 1960s looked exactly like this: bold fashion, sharp poses, and a red double-decker bus behind it all. In one frame, the city feels young, stylish, and fully aware it was setting the tone for the decade. In Burma in 1946, soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army stand trial for the massacre of an entire village of more than 1,000 people. The numbered tags turned each man into evidence in one of the first post-war war crimes cases. Subscribe for daily historical photos and write in the comments which one stayed with you most. Thanks for watching.